So I wanted to talk tonight about our relationship with fear during this challenging time. And I think fear is up for a lot of us in a more dramatic way. Fear of the unknown, fear of uncertainty, fear of loss, fear of isolation should we get sick, fear of financial stress, fear of name something else. I mean, I think fear is up all around us. And it's a difficult time, and it just seemed like an appropriate subject to talk about. And I think our challenge is to find ways to not let it consume us. I mean, we can either face it with courage and compassion, or we can withdraw and contract. And that really becomes our challenge, I think. And as you know, fear comes in many forms. It comes in the form of worry, impending doom, anxiety, panic, terror, anxious anticipation, and so forth and so on. But what all of these have in common, we talk about this frequently, is they involve the activation of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the fight, flight, or freeze response. And so we end up wanting to run away, we end up wanting to sort of hunker down and fight, or we end up freezing in response in the face of our fears. Pema Chodron says, quote, "It is not a terrible thing that we feel fear when faced with the unknown. It is part of being alive, something we all share. Fear is a natural reaction to moving closer to the truth." She then goes on to say that brave people aren't free of fear, rather they're very intimate with it. She tells a story about when she was married that her husband said he was, even though she was a coward, she was one of the bravest people that he knew, because regardless of what the fear was, she went ahead and did things anyway. And I think that's instructive in terms of how we might think about dealing with our fears. Because this is our real challenge, especially during this pandemic. Do we recoil and run away, or do we face our fears and try to be fully present? You may have seen that recent New York Times interview with Jack Kornfield, in which he said, and I quote, "What's needed in a time like this are ways to steady the heart. The first step is acknowledgement and the willingness to be present. You could almost whisper to yourself, sadness, fear, anxiety, grief, longing, as if to bow to that feeling and hold it with respect. That allows the feeling to open, maybe even intensify for a bit, but eventually to soften. The next step is to bring a sense of compassion for all the fears and confusion and helplessness. These feelings are all part of the fight, flight, or freeze instinct in the mind and the body. If I make space for the feelings and they have time to be felt, it's as if my awareness gets bigger and I can hold all of this with greater ease and compassion and presence and steadiness. It's as if my awareness gets bigger and I can hold all of this with greater ease and compassion and presence and steadiness." This is a recent poem by Lynn Unger called Pandemic. She says, "What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel. Cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body becomes still, Reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has become clear. Do not reach out your hands. Reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, as long as we all shall live. It's called Pandemic by Lynn Ungar. Because of our capacity for imagination, we experience fear and anxiety regularly. And as we often talk about, this is part of our evolutionary heritage. It's true that a certain amount of anxiety is necessary in life because it makes us take sensible precautions. It can enhance performance up to a point. It helps us adhere to social norms and so forth. But as our practice deepens, we tend to encounter fears, some of which we didn't even know existed within us. And that's true especially now, I think, during the pandemic. But if we are alert and curious about our fears, then we can allow these fears to become our teacher and also serve our spiritual growth. And by doing this, we give meaning to needless suffering, gives purpose to our suffering. And what I'm talking about here are ways in which we can contextualize our fear in order to begin working with it mindfully. And it's important to remember that whether it's anxiety, fear, or panic, that these are subjective internal experiences. We get triggered externally, or we may get triggered internally, but they're subjective experiences. There's something that are internal to us in terms of the actual experience of anxiety, fear, or panic. And the more established we become in our practice and our mindfulness, then the less likely it is that we're going to escalate from sort of apprehension to fear and even possibly to terror. We learn to be with our fear as we do with any other experience. We talk about welcoming whatever comes up for us, whatever comes up in our practice. And that's especially true when we're dealing with our fears. Ajahn Sumedho, the Theravada monk, says that in order to disidentify with fear as it arises, we can make a mental notation such as anxiety is like this, fear is like this, anxiety is happening, fear is happening, as a way of just noting it, accepting it, welcoming it, not fighting it, fleeing from it, freezing from it. Because our challenge is really to accept that we can never be absolutely safe. And boy, is that more true now than ever. You know, the Dharma teaches us that all things change constantly, even that which is most precious to us. This is really the sort of existential angst of our human existence. It's really the price we pay for being conscious human beings. It's not a flaw, it's not a defect, it's not something that we need to be rid of. We couldn't if we wanted to, though many of us have trouble not seeing it as a flaw, I think. But I think one of the real values of a spiritual life and spiritual practice is that we're able to come to terms with this anxiety and our fears in a conscious manner. We become conscious of them, we become conscious when they arise, and our life becomes more integrated because we're not trying to deny what is or avoid that which is true. Again, there's the need to welcome whatever comes up. Very often when we're practicing, we'll have a specific fear come up, and then that'll get superimposed upon the sort of generalized anxiety that we're all feeling now, or most of us are feeling now. or that is just inherent in the sort of the existential anxiety that comes up from being human. But with our mindfulness practice, we see how the untrained mind is agitated by this. And then we can begin to, by welcoming it, by not trying to avoid it or push it away, not exacerbate it. We learn to gain tolerance for the unpleasantness of uncertainty. We gain tolerance for the unpleasantness of uncertainty. We develop confidence that life is like this, just as it is. So we cannot and we're not supposed to miraculously fix our fear. But we gain the insight that happiness and peace comes from relating to life just as it is, fear or not. That acceptance really brings a certain equanimity, a certain peace of mind. Very often, especially when we're on longer retreats and we're sitting for longer periods of time, we can kind of get blindsided by some pretty significant fear, anxiety coming up during our sitting practice. And our first sort of reflexive tendency, because of the fight, flight, or freeze, is to try to distract ourselves or give up or stop sitting or whatever. But it's been my experience, and I think for a lot of us, that if we can stay with this uncomfortable experience, that it tends to sort of unwind itself both physically and mentally. It's just being present with it. We have to show up for it. The Buddha talked about learning to work with fear in the Pali Canon, in the middle length discourses in the fourth sutta, which translates as fear and dread. He describes to a Brahmin the qualities required of a monk who's living in the forest, living alone in the forest. And then he relates an account of his own attempts to conquer fear when striving for enlightenment. You may recall that story that Mara comes to the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment. And he bombards the Buddha with fears and other temptations and all kinds of things to try to discourage him. But the Buddha reaches down and touches the ground. He grounds himself. He grounds himself is a way of being present with the fears that Mara was trying to throw at him, and defeats Mara and goes on and becomes enlightened. Now, what I usually recommend is that what we do is mindfully work with sort of smaller and more approachable fears and see what happens. I mean, we don't have to sort of jump into the whole deep end right from the get-go. But when we work with fear from a position of benevolence and goodwill toward ourselves, it's much easier to face these fears rather than have them become oppressive. Yes, we're afraid. Yes, we feel the fears. Yes, we are aware of what's going on in the world now. But instead of fighting what faces us, we embrace it and we accept it. It's sometimes useful to use a phrase such as, may I find freedom from fear in my life. May I also help others find freedom from fear in their lives. And may I meet the fear in our culture with the courage of an open heart, which acts with decisiveness but never divisiveness. May I find freedom from fear in my life. So in the face of fears, as they come up, we can either fight with them in the moment, either physically or mentally, or which just creates more turmoil in the mind. Or we can say, this is simply what's happening. Fear is happening. This is fear. And by doing that, the mind gives up its usual hope for a different reality, for having things different than it is, things different than they are. And when it gives up the hope to have things be different than they are, then the mind typically relaxes. So by letting go of the wish to have things be different, the mind settles. So in the simplest terms, managing fear is just a simple gesture of accepting whatever there is in the moment. It's that this is what's happening in this moment. It can't be other than this. This is what is, and that truth is always soothing. It's that this is what's happening in this moment. It can't be other than this. So I'd like to close with a poem this is another recent poem by Brother Richard Hendrick. He's an Irish Franciscan Catholic monk, and it's called Lockdown. It's rather long, but I think it really speaks to some of where we are, so just bear with me. He says, yes, there is fear. Yes, there is isolation. Yes, there is panic buying. Yes, there is sickness. Yes, there's even death. But they say that in Wuhan, after many years of noise, you can hear the birds again. They say that after just a few weeks of quiet, the sky is no longer thick with fumes, but blue and gray and clear. They say that in the streets of Assisi, people are singing to each other across the empty squares, keeping their windows open so that those who are alone may hear the sounds of family around them. They say that at a hotel in the west of Ireland is offering free meals and delivery to the housebound. Today, a young woman I know is busy spreading flyers with her number through the neighborhood so that the elders may have someone to call on. Today, churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples are preparing to welcome and shelter the homeless, the sick, the weary. All over the world, people are slowing down and reflecting. All over the world, people are looking at their neighbors in a new way. All over the world, people are waking up to a new reality, to how big we really are, to how little control we really have, to what really matters, to love. So we pray and remember that, yes, there is fear, but there does not have to be hate. Yes, there's isolation, but there does not have to be loneliness. Yes, there's panic buying, but there does not have to be meanness. Yes, there's sickness, but there does not have to be disease of the soul. Yes, there's even death, but there is always the rebirth of love. Wake up to the choices you make as to how to live now, today. Breathe. Listen. Behind the factory noises of your panic, the birds are singing again. The sky is clearing. Spring is coming. And we are always encompassed by love. Open the windows of your soul, and though you may not be able to touch across the empty square, sing. So may we all meet our fear, pain, and sorrow with acceptance and hold it with compassion. Please practice self-care and care of those you love. Stay safe. Thanks for your time and attention.